Yeah, well, maybe we'll. So like, I think I was interested in a recent piece you wrote about kind of the impact of RFK and Charles Eisenstein, and how, in a way, together they may have helped really swing the election. I mean, obviously RFK had a lot more, influence and reach and so on. But yeah, kind of curious about your thoughts around that, and what motivated you to write that piece, and how you're feeling about the situation like right now.
Was very concerned that RFK Jr. could play a spoiler role and tip the election toward Trump. I was concerned about that from the very beginning, as soon as he announced his intent, his campaign. What I did not anticipate, though, was that he would throw his weight in with Trump. I never thought that RFK Jr. would go full Trump, and so when he said he's going to drop out of the race, I was like, good, this is good, this is good. I thought if Kennedy was in and on the ballot in a lot of states, it could tip the election to Trump. Again, repeating myself, never conceived that RFK Jr. would fall in line with Trump, would endorse Trump, and this sort of thing. So the reason why I wrote the most recent piece, which is, I give these long titles because I feel like we live in this scrolling world where sometimes the only message somebody's going to see is the title. And so I tend to give these long titles. This one was called, yes, RFK Jr. and Charles Eisenstein were 1,000% wrong about Trump and Project 2025. And then I put in parentheses, i.e. his entire agenda. I mean, I think that's an important point. To be wrong about whether Trump's going to implement Project 2025 or not is to be wrong about Trump's entire agenda. There's not much more to be wrong about regarding the incoming Trump campaign if you're wrong about whether or not he's going to implement Project 2025. So, but the thing is, when one is writing before an election, one can be tempted to say all kinds of things, and you don't know what's going to come to pass. You don't know exactly you don't know who's going to win the election. You don't know what Trump's going to do if he gets elected. So I just thought it was incredibly irresponsible of RFK Jr. And then Charles to pick it up and to broadcast it out to his, 80,000 readers on his Substack that, Trump said, Trump said he's not going to do Project 2025. I mean, you've got millions of last-minute independent voters at the last minute, and they're all getting freaked out when they're hearing, Project 2025. The more people heard about it, the more they disliked it, the more they didn't want to vote for Trump. So it was obvious when Trump said, "Oh no, Project 2025. No, we're not going to do that. I've never heard of it." That was the most transparent kind of rollback and ass covering.
Well,
and so, yeah, just to finish the point real quick, I thought it was remarkably irresponsible for RFK Jr. and Charles Eisenstein to say, hey, look, Trump says he's not going to do Project 2025. He says he doesn't even know the guy involved in it. And so you guys, you don't have to worry. Trump's not going to do Project 2025.
No, I get it. Okay, so let's talk a bit about Charles Eisenstein, because I mean, you've really been, so both of us knew Charles personally. I had a platform, Reality Sandwich. He did a lot of writing for that platform. I really gave him, helped him have a bigger platform at that point. And I also published and edited his book, Sacred Economics. And I was quite a huge fan, although I did early on begin to have a little bit of, kind of worries here and there. The sort of like Sacred Economics, to me, what he actually proposed seemed still very nebulous. Yeah, he felt over time a little bit maybe more about himself than about really trying to like do something bigger. But I never would have anticipated that he would have had this sort of psychological collapse, in a sense, to end up really supporting this right-wing Trump movement. Although of course he uses kind of sophistry or rhetoric in a way to make it a little bit unclear. And I think, I also didn't like his book Coronation, which I think is when you started also to be like, ring some alarm bells. So let's talk a little bit, like, what's your perspective on Charles? I mean, it's not that he's like, the biggest, fish in the fishbowl, but maybe a little bit like a trim tab, in that it was Buckminster Fuller's idea that there's like the rudder which turns the ship, and on the end of the rudder is like a trim tab, and the trim tab turns the rudder, which then turns the big ocean liner. So Charles, having a certain level of reach, and he'd sort of taken this position of like moral authority in a sense, like people looked up to him as somebody who really was speaking from a truth perspective, who wasn't, kind of like what wasn't sort of corrupt to like financial stuff and so on. He somehow created this very sort of moral position for himself as somebody that people looked up to in, our extended communities. And therefore, when he kind of opened the gates for, RFK and then for Trump, it did seem, and that a lot of people kind of that he gave an opportunity or an opening for a lot of people, to kind of move in that direction. Is that how you see it? And what do you think happened with him? How do you feel that his, where did he go kind of off in a way?
Yeah, I agree with your analysis for sure. I think it's interesting. I actually was critiquing Charles before the pandemic, though, which I think is interesting because the first time I posted kind of a public critique was after he wrote an essay before the pandemic called "The Polarization Trap," and in it he was saying, the trap is we're becoming polarized, one against the other, left versus right, this and that, and which I thought was as with a lot of Charles's work, there are good sentiments and some decent intentions, in there. But I thought the way he laid out his argument was false equivalence, to the nth degree. He was in the polarization trap essay. He was at one point he compared people saying that Obama is born in Kenya, this kind of racist birtherism myth that really launched Donald Trump into politics in his most recent incarnation. That was equivalent to, the so-called Russiagate hoax, Russiagate. Well, actually, the Trump campaign had 157 contacts, with people connected to Russia and the Kremlin, whereas the idea that Obama is a foreign usurper born in Kenya is a completely made up racist myth. So I said, I said, I'm concerned about some false equivalence that I'm detecting in this. And so then, as the pandemic comes along, all of these tendencies in Charles's work got amplified, right? It got exacerbated. So this kind of false equivalence, this kind of both sidesism. Again, there's a time and a place to say, look, we all, are involved in this system and you're no different from me. But that can't become a substitute for a realistic political analysis. And this was my concern with Charles's work, is that he didn't have a power analysis. He didn't have a racial justice analysis. He didn't really have a strong social justice analysis, so he would nod in these directions. And I think, what has come to pass. And so to me, it felt like I didn't trust that he was grounded in a real analysis of social justice and power. And guess what? If you can create common cause with this Trump campaign, then I think, my concerns, were realized that he was not grounded in a way. I started my one of my in one of my recent Substacks, I quoted the kind of phrase, the folk wisdom that says, if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. If
Yeah.
you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. I felt Charles wasn't clear on what he stood for, and he ended up falling for the Trump campaign.